The fence came down on a Tuesday. By Thursday morning, a 300-pound black bear was in Patricia Hensley's garbage cans at the end of the cul-de-sac. A second bear had pushed through the Delgado family's screen porch door and consumed $14 worth of dog food. And a sow with 2 cubs had established what Colorado Parks and Wildlife Officer Dana Reeves later described, in her incident report, as a comfort zone in the common area behind lots 7 through 11 that suggested prior familiarity with the space. Prior familiarity, meaning the bears had been there before. Meaning they had been coming to that area on the other side of my fence for some time. Meaning the fence had been working. The fence the HOA board had voted 4-1 to remove, citing aesthetic inconsistency with community standards, at a meeting I had not been notified of, using a contractor I had not authorized, acting on a complaint filed by a woman named Karen Whitmore who had described my fence as an eyesore and a property value concern, and had apparently not mentioned, in her complaint, the reason the fence existed. Karen had known the reason the fence existed. I had told her 11 months before the board meeting, on a Tuesday afternoon when she had leaned over my side gate to ask why I was installing what she called that industrial-looking thing along the back of my property. I had explained it directly and in detail. I had shown her the CPW guidance on bear-resistant fencing. I had shown her the incident log I had been keeping since the first bear contact 18 months earlier. She had listened, she had nodded, she had said she understood. Then she had filed a complaint with the HOA board that made no mention of bears. The fence had taken me 6 weeks to build, $8,000 to material and install, and 14 months of documentation with CPW to justify. It was not beautiful. It was 8 feet of welded steel mesh on steel posts, set in concrete footings, designed to the specifications that wildlife management professionals recommended for persistent bear activity zones in residential areas adjacent to natural habitat corridors. It was effective. 14 months of effectiveness, confirmed by my trail cameras and by CPW's assessment, and by the complete absence of bear incidents on my property or on the adjacent properties to the east and west of my lot during the 14 months it stood. The HOA board voted to remove it on a Monday. By Thursday, the bears were back. What happened in the 4 months after that Thursday, what the HOA's insurance carrier discovered, what CPW's formal assessment produced, what the documentation I had been keeping for 2.5 years contained, and what Karen Whitmore said when she understood the full scope of what she had caused, none of that was about the fence. The fence was just the thing that had been standing between 300 pounds of apex wildlife and a neighborhood that had decided, without adequate information, that aesthetics were more important than function. The documentation was about what happens when someone removes a system they don't understand. And the consequences were about what happens when bears remember where the food was. My name is Desmond Holt, 49 years old, 17 years as a licensed wildlife biologist specializing in human-wildlife interface management in the Colorado Rockies. The last 8 years running my own consulting firm, working with municipalities, HOAs, CPW, and private landowners on the specific and increasingly complex problem of residential communities situated in or adjacent to active wildlife corridors. I understand bears. I understand their behavior, their movement patterns, their memory, their capacity for habituation, and the specific mechanisms by which a residential community becomes incorporated into a bear's learned foraging range. I understand what it takes to discourage that incorporation and what it costs when discouragement fails. My wife Sylvia is a land use attorney. She has spent 16 years working on the legal intersection of private property rights and wildlife management. The cases where what a homeowner wants to do with their land conflicts with what wildlife agencies need to happen, or where what a community governance body decides affects a wildlife management situation they did not know existed. We had moved to Ridgecrest Commons 4 years ago, a 43-home HOA on the western slope of the Front Range, situated at the edge of a designated wildlife corridor that ran from federal wilderness land through a patchwork of private and state parcels to the open space preserve at the southern end of our valley. The corridor was documented in CPW's habitat connectivity maps. It was the reason the town's development code required wildlife-resistant garbage enclosures for all new construction in our zone. It was also the reason bears moved through our neighborhood regularly enough that most residents had a bear story and some residents had several. The first bear contact at my property happened 8 months after we moved in. A juvenile male, approximately 180 pounds, had pushed through the wooden lattice fence I had along the back of my property and accessed my compost area. I had documented it with trail cameras. I maintained cameras on my property as part of my professional practice and had reported it to CPW. CPW's response was thorough and useful. They assessed the site, identified the movement corridor the bear was using, and provided guidance on deterrence measures. Their primary recommendation was barrier reinforcement. The wooden lattice was inadequate, they said, and the site's position at the corridor boundary made persistent activity likely. I asked what adequate looked like. They gave me the specification for bear-resistant fencing in active interface zones. Welded steel mesh, minimum 16 gauge, on steel posts, minimum 8 feet height, concrete footings. I asked whether this was commonly installed in residential settings. They said it was uncommon because it was expensive and visually significant, but that for properties in my position at the corridor boundary with documented contact, it was the appropriate response. I built the fence in month 10, after 3 more bear contacts and a conversation with CPW officer Dana Reeves that made clear the juvenile male had been joined by a sow and cubs who were using the same access point and had begun to habituate to the property. Habituation, the word wildlife managers use when a wild animal loses its natural wariness of human spaces because repeated non-negative contact has taught it that those spaces are safe. Habituated bears are the problem bears, the ones that eventually cause property damage, threaten people, and require lethal removal. The management goal is always to prevent habituation before it occurs, because reversing it is difficult and sometimes impossible. The fence was expensive and not beautiful. It was also exactly what CPW had specified and exactly what the situation required. I built it with the same professional standard I applied to the wildlife interface projects I designed for clients, correctly to specification, with documentation of every design decision and every CPW consultation. Corinne Whitmore had moved into the property adjacent to mine on the west side 14 months after the fence was completed. She was 54, former interior designer, now what she described as a residential aesthetic consultant, which appeared to mean she had strong and organized opinions about how things should look and the social energy to pursue those opinions through community channels. The fence was the first thing she mentioned when she introduced herself. She said it was the most industrial-looking structure she had seen in a residential neighborhood and asked whether I had considered alternatives. I explained the fence to her, the bear corridor, the documented contacts, the CPW guidance, the habituation risk, the specification the fence was built to. She listened. She appeared to understand. She said she appreciated the explanation and hoped we could find a way to address the aesthetic impact. I said the fence was what the situation required and that I was not planning to modify it. She said she understood. I noted the conversation in my documentation log. I had been keeping the log since the first bear contact, dates, observations, CPW communications, trail camera records, and any conversations with neighbors or HOA officials about the fence or the wildlife situation. I noted Corinne's visit and her stated concern about aesthetics. 3 months after that conversation, I received a notice from the HOA board informing me that a complaint had been filed regarding my rear fence and that the board would be reviewing the complaint at its next meeting. The notice informed me that the review meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. I had not received the standard 2-week notification that the HOA's own governance documents required for matters involving a member's private property. I called the board president, a retired banker named Howard Kimball, who ran the board with the organized efficiency of his former profession, and who had, in my experience, been fair and process-oriented. Howard said the notification had been sent to my email address on file. I checked the email address on file. It was an old address I no longer monitored, from a prior employment that I had not updated when I changed my primary account 14 months earlier, an administrative error on my part that I acknowledged. Howard said the board would proceed with the Monday meeting, but that I was welcome to attend and present information. I attended Monday's meeting with the complete documentation file, 2.5 years of bare contact records, CPW correspondence, the fence specification, the habitat corridor assessment, and Officer Reeves's contact information. The meeting had already been running for 40 minutes when I arrived. The complaint had been presented, the board had asked questions, and a preliminary vote had been taken. 4-1 in favor of requiring removal of the fence as an aesthetic violation of the HOA's architectural standards. I asked to present information before any final action was taken. Karen was present. She was sitting in the third row with 2 other homeowners I recognized as members of the Neighborhood Aesthetics Committee she had organized 6 months earlier. I presented the documentation. I described the corridor. I explained habituation. I showed the trail camera footage of the 4 bare contacts that had preceded the fence installation and the 0 contacts in the 14 months since. I read from CPW Officer Reeves's assessment, which described the fence as an appropriate response to a documented wildlife management situation. I provided Officer Reeves's contact information and offered to arrange a presentation for the board. The board president thanked me for the information. Then he said the board had already voted and that while the wildlife information was useful context, the fence was in violation of the HOA's architectural standards and the vote would stand. He said I could appeal the decision through the standard process, which allowed 30 days for a written appeal. I said I was filing the appeal immediately and that I requested the fence not be disturbed pending the appeal outcome. The board said the standard process allowed 14 days for compliance after the vote and that the appeal timeline was separate. I said the timelines were inconsistent and that removing the fence before the appeal was resolved would create a wildlife safety situation that could not be reversed. The board said it would note my concern. I filed the written appeal that night. I also called Officer Reeves Tuesday morning and briefed her on the situation. She said she would contact the HOA board directly and offer to present CPW's assessment at the appeal hearing. She called me back Tuesday afternoon. She said the board had informed her that the removal was scheduled for Thursday and that the appeal hearing was scheduled for the following Wednesday. I said the sequence made no sense. Removing the fence before the appeal hearing eliminated the subject of the appeal. She said she had expressed the same concern to the board president. She said the board president had said the contractor was already scheduled. The contractor arrived Thursday at 7:15. I was at my property. I told the contractor that the fence was the subject of an active appeal and that proceeding would be premature. The contractor said he had a signed work order from the HOA and that the board's instruction was to proceed. I called Sylvia from my front yard while the contractor began work. She said, "How fast can they take it down?" I said, "A few hours." She said, "I'll file for an emergency injunction, but court opening is 9, and by the time we get through the process, it'll be done." I said I knew. She said, "Document everything." I documented everything, every phase of the removal with timestamps, the contractor's equipment, the work order number visible on his clipboard, the HOA board representative who arrived at 8:30 to oversee the work. I photographed the fence section by section as it came down. The fence was fully removed by 11:45 Thursday morning. By Thursday evening, the bears were back. They had been there before, they knew the space. The fence had been the barrier between their learned foraging route and the neighborhood. With the barrier gone, the route was open again, and bears with established routes used them. Patricia Hensley called me Thursday night about her garbage cans. I already knew about the Delgado incident because the Delgados had posted about it in the neighborhood group. I called Officer Reeves. She arrived Friday morning and assessed the situation. She confirmed what the trail cameras on my property were showing: 3 different bears in the area overnight, using the corridor access point that the fence had blocked. She filed an incident report Friday afternoon. The report described the wildlife contacts, the corridor location, the prior fence installation, and the sequence of events that had resulted in the fence's removal the day before the first contact. The report also described the habituation history. The bears' prior familiarity with the space before the fence was installed, which the fence had successfully interrupted, and which the fence's removal had allowed to resume. She sent me a copy. I added it to the documentation file. The HOA board called an emergency meeting Friday evening. I attended. The meeting had a different quality than Monday's. Monday had been organized, managed, the efficient processing of an aesthetic complaint. Friday was the board president and 4 board members looking at photographs of bear damage and an incident report from CPW and trying to understand what had happened. Howard Kimball said, "I need to understand the relationship between the fence removal and the bear activity." I explained it, with the documentation, with the incident report, with the trail camera footage that showed bears using the corridor access point within 31 hours of the fence coming down. Howard said the bears were waiting for the fence to come down. "Not waiting in any intentional sense," I said. "Bears don't plan, but they have spatial memory of routes that have been productive for them. The fence interrupted the route. When the fence was removed, the route was open again. And you told us this would happen." "I told you the fence was a wildlife management structure with a documented function," I said. "I told you removing it before the appeal hearing would create a situation that couldn't be reversed. I filed a written appeal 24 hours before the removal." Howard looked at the table. The board member who had been the dissenting vote on Monday, a woman named Clara Osai, who had asked for the appeal before voting no, said, "We need to discuss the fence being reinstalled." Karen said from the 3rd row that the fence was still an aesthetic violation regardless of the wildlife situation. Clara said, "Karen, there are bears in this neighborhood because we removed a fence that was keeping bears out. I think we can discuss aesthetics after we address that." Karen said the community should not have to choose between safety and appearance. I said, "You have chosen. The board voted to remove the fence. The consequence of that choice is currently in Patricia Hensley's garbage cans." The room was quiet. Howard said, "What do we need to do?" I said, "You need to reinstall the fence. You need to contact CPW for an assessment of the current situation. You need to issue a bear safety notice to every household. And you need to have the appeal hearing you scheduled for Wednesday, even though the subject of the appeal has been removed, because the appeal process needs to produce a finding that establishes the fence as a permitted wildlife management structure that cannot be removed without CPW authorization." Howard said, "Can we vote tonight to reinstall?" Sylvia, who was sitting beside me, said, "The vote to remove was a final board action. Reversing it requires a new vote with proper notice to the membership. You cannot vote tonight without the required notification period." She paused. "However, the board has emergency authority under its own governance documents for imminent safety risks. 3 bears in the neighborhood within 31 hours of a barrier removal qualifies as an imminent safety risk." Howard called the emergency vote. The board voted 4-1 to authorize emergency reinstallation of the fence pending the formal appeal hearing. The dissenting vote was from Karen's ally on the board, a man named Robert Stanton, who said he was concerned about the precedent. Clara said the precedent she was concerned about was bear attacks. The contractor was contacted Saturday morning. The fence reinstallation began Monday. It was completed Wednesday, 3 hours before the appeal hearing. The appeal hearing was the most formally organized HOA meeting I had attended. Sylvia had prepared for it the way she prepared for legal proceedings, a complete documentation file, tabbed and indexed, with copies for every board member. The file contained the 2.5 years of bare contact records, the CPW correspondence, the fence specification, and its CPW basis, the trail camera footage before and after the fence, the incident reports from the 3 days following removal, and Officer Reeves's assessment. Officer Reeves attended in person. She addressed the board for 20 minutes, describing the wildlife corridor, the habituation history, the function of the fence, and CPW's position that the fence was an appropriate and necessary wildlife management measure for the specific site. She also described, in her measured and factual way, what happened when bears habituate to residential areas, the property damage, the safety risk, and the eventual outcome when lethal removal becomes necessary. She said lethal removal had become necessary in 3 of the 7 cases she had managed in this corridor over the preceding decade. In all 3 cases, the animal had been habituated through a period of inadequate barrier management. The board voted to approve the appeal and to classify the fence as a permitted wildlife management structure exempt from the HOA's standard architectural review process, subject to annual CPW confirmation that the installation remained appropriate. 5-0. Karen did not vote. She had resigned from her position on the Aesthetics Committee the previous Saturday in a brief email to Howard that cited personal reasons and offered no further explanation. She came to my door Thursday morning. The fence was back. The bears had not been seen in the neighborhood since the reinstallation, though my trail cameras showed corridor activity continuing on the other side of the barrier. The bears were using the route, they just weren't getting through. Karen stood on my front porch. She was not carrying anything. She did not have the organized preparation of someone delivering a presentation. She said, "I didn't mention the bears in my complaint." "No," I said. "I knew about them. You told me. I thought," she stopped. "I thought you were being disproportionate. I thought the fence was more about your professional interests than about an actual safety concern. I thought the bears were an excuse for an industrial installation that you preferred for other reasons." "What other reasons would those be?" I said. She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. I couldn't identify them specifically, but I was certain the fence was wrong, and I looked for reasons, and the bears were the reason you gave, and I decided it wasn't sufficient." I said, a wildlife biologist with 2.5 years of documented bear contact history and a CPW assessment recommending barrier installation was not sufficient. "I thought you were overstating it." Patricia Hensley's garbage cans were 36 hours after the fence came down. "I know," she said. She was quiet for a long time. "Is there something you want to say?" I said. "I'm sorry," she said. "I dismissed information I should have taken seriously because it was inconvenient to my conclusion. I filed a complaint that was incomplete because including the full information would have undermined my complaint." She paused. I knew that when I filed it. I looked at her for a moment. The specific and clear admission, not an explanation, not a reframing, not a justification, an admission. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "Does it change anything?" "It changes my understanding of what happened," I said. "It doesn't change what happened." She nodded. She turned and went back across the street. Sylvia was in the kitchen. She had heard the conversation through the open window. She said she knew when she filed it. "Yes," I said. "That's different from someone who made an honest mistake." "Yes," I said, "it is." "Are you satisfied with how this resolved?" I thought about the fence, standing again behind my property, about the trail camera footage of bears using the corridor on the other side of it. About the 14 months before the removal when the neighborhood had been safe because a barrier was in place, and the 3 days after the removal when the neighborhood had not been safe because the barrier was gone, and the 43 households in Ridgecrest Commons who now had a formal board finding that the fence was a permitted safety structure that could not be removed without CPW authorization. Yes, I said, the outcome is correct. And Karen admitted what she did and why she did it, I said. I'm not required to carry that indefinitely. Sylvia poured coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. The fence was standing. The corridor was documented. The board finding was in the HOA record. CPW's assessment was in the HOA record. The appeal outcome was in the HOA record. All of it would remain in the record for as long as the HOA maintained records. Which meant the next time someone looked at my fence and thought about filing a complaint, they would find everything I had just described. Permanent, clear, self-evident. The bears would keep using the corridor. That was what corridors were for: movement, connection, the continuity of habitat in a fragmented landscape. The fence didn't stop the corridor. It stopped the neighborhood from being incorporated into it. That was the distinction. That was what the documentation said. That was what the board finding confirmed. My property was at the boundary. The fence was on the boundary. The bears were on one side and the neighborhood was on the other, and the fence was what made that arrangement stable. Stable was what I had been working toward for 2.5 years. The fence was standing. Stable was what we had. Framed thumbnail text. She had them tear it down Tuesday. The bears were back by Thursday.